Welcome to a Mackenzie Institute Long Talk. James Barrat is looking into things that are of interest to the Mackenzie Institute and to all of us who are interested in security. I think it's really all captured in the title of the book, Our Final Invention. So does that mean that robots or artificial intelligence are the last thing we invent because it cures all the problems we have, difficult jobs, curing cancer, what have you? Or is it the final invention because they take over and we're a footnote to history? James Barrat, explain yourself, please.
It's both. It's an ambiguous title on purpose because it could be that, as I.J. Good said, I paraphrase I.J. Good. He's a statistician who came up with the concept of the intelligence explosion. And he said, when we create machines smarter than us, they'll be the last invention we ever need to make, and they'll solve all our problems. On the flip side, however, AI is a dual-use technology capable of great good and great harm, and it could spell our doom, as Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, and countless others have said.
Well, and speaking of those famous and rich people, I'm kind of surprised about two things in your book. One is that 56 countries have serious initiatives in the artificial intelligence area for military purposes. I didn't know 56 countries had the money or the interest in that. And secondly, all the wealthy people, or several wealthy people, are also experimenting with it. Talk about those two streams, if you will.
Sure. 56 nations aren't developing autonomous battlefield robots. Only about 4 or 5 are. 56 nations are developing battlefield robots and drone systems. The most sought after will be those that act autonomously or kill without a human in the loop. The countries that are working on them are the United States, Russia, China, Israel, and Great Britain. So there's only 5 that are developing autonomous weapons, and these again are weapons that kill without a human in the loop, and it's richly funded in those countries.
And what are the other 51 or 2 doing if it isn't autonomous battlefield machines?
Just making battlefield machines to take the place of soldiers, and they can be the ones that are being used right now all over the world by the United States, especially in Central Asia, are driven by pilots who are thousands of miles away, but there's still a human in the decision loop. However, just the way that the CIA was fighting a covert war with drones in Central Asia for a decade before we knew about it, I've got little doubt that autonomous battlefield robots and drones are in the field now. In fact, Israel has a new one that has been in the air, I think, for like 4 months, and it basically it's a drone that itself has a conventional warhead, not a nuclear warhead, but a conventional warhead, and when it flies in the airspace over Israel, and when something locks on it to target it, it dives on it and destroys it with itself. And it does that autonomously without anyone else making the kill decision.
Now, in your book, you document 2, and I'm sure there are more, but 2 errors with the use of this technology, killing several people. One incident took 8 seconds to transpire. Can you tell me about those?
Well, that was a South African, that was an anti-tank gun, and it was at a display in South Africa. And it was an autonomous system, but it wasn't intelligent. It wasn't using AI, but it was using it was a mechanized system that acted independently, and it simply misfired. It targeted the spectators at this display, and it blew up a display stand and killed 8 people. There was another one in Iraq. It was again, it was not autonomous, but it was a mechanized gun that started shooting at everybody, and they packed it up and sent it away, and we haven't heard from that gun again.
Well, probably a good idea. There are 2 schools of thought about this. I bet a lot of people watching are saying, well, this is good. Humans won't be dying. It's machines that are going to crash into each other and blow each other up. And isn't that a good idea? The other sentiment is probably expressed at the end of the movie Patton, which is probably a favorite of viewers, in which the Patton character, played by George C. Scott, says, well, this will be no resolution, no drama, no heroics. It will be robotics. What's your view of the future of warfare?
I think we can see how this plays out if we start fielding autonomous battlefield robots. What it won't be machines against machines. It'll be rich countries fielding machines and poor countries fielding good old humans. And it will be battlefield robots slaughtering peasant armies. And the problem with the technology, just put aside the moral issue for the moment, and that's really, do we want to be the generation that fields robots and drones that kill people on their own? I don't think we do. But there's a real issue in the technology. How do you tell friend from foe? How do you tell civilian from combatant? Until these questions are answered, we can't responsibly field these weapons.
Well, and as I'm sure you know, there is international law and protocols on the use of military force against civilian targets. But these days, the electrical grid is used by the military. The GPS system developed for the military is used by civilians. Everybody uses the road, and that's going to be a hard definition to parse in the future. So what about the use of artificial intelligence and robots against civilian targets like the electrical grid in your country, which could easily be shut off and deprive 131 million Americans of power and maybe take months to come back on?
It's a really horrific scenario. The one statistic that sticks with me is that if you cut off significant chunks of the grid, only 1 in 10 people are alive a year later if the outage lasts that long. And the dying starts right away as refrigeration goes away, and babies are dependent on formula and refrigeration. So it's a horrific scenario, and unfortunately our grid, as you said, is woefully vulnerable. There's evidence that there's spyware in a lot of our grids right now. The small sidebar, we basically gave the instructions on how to attack the grid when we released the Stuxnet virus. The Stuxnet virus attacked the same Siemens-built industrial controllers in an Iranian nuclear refinery. It attacked the same controllers that we use to undergrid to power all our electrical grids. So we've given away the instructions on how to sabotage our grid successfully.
Well, let's riff on that for a bit, and I think that you might be tolerant of being the victim of the popular mechanics problem. Judging from your gray hair, you may be old enough to have remembered all those wonderful popular mechanics books that I read that predicted mail delivery by rockets, robots cleaning your home, and all this stuff. And yet,
robots do clean our home.
Pardon me?
I have a Roomba. Robots do clean our home.
Yes, indeed. And I saw a robot mowing a lawn in Germany 35 years ago. So some of that has come to pass.
Yeah.
But you rightly point out with the Stuxnet virus that it was a smuggled USB into the Iranian facility. And in the height of the Cold War, the proverbial good-looking female spy talked her way into your embassy in Moscow and put a gizmo in an IBM Selectric typewriter to record the keystrokes and turn it into text. So in some way, we don't need the science, or sometimes it's science fiction scenarios. Plain old garden variety incompetence and poor security at the door and not locking the door can do the same kind of damage.
Oh, yeah. There was a famous case where someone dropped flash drives in a parking lot of I think it was Raytheon. And they just scattered them around, and people said, "Oh, a free flash drive," and they started using them. And of course, there was a Trojan horse on those flash drives, and it was a Chinese operation to steal a lot of plans, and it succeeded.
Yeah, free stuff is pretty tempting, even in high security facilities. Now, can we go back to Isaac Asimov's 3 rules for robotics that you rightly point out can be circumvented? Can you enumerate them and say how they won't work?
Okay, if I can recall them, I dismissed them in the first chapter of my book, Our Final Invention. A robot will not harm a human. It will not allow itself to be harmed, and it won't. I'm not even sure of the third one.
Well, those 2 are enough, because you do rightly point out how a robot might be asked to feed me forever, and that might involve killing a whole bunch of other people or some sort of unintended consequences like that.
Well, the book in which those three laws came out, it's called Irobot by Asimov. And the whole book is a series of unintended consequences when the laws do not work together, when the laws conflict. There's one called Runabout, where a robot goes out on Mars to find a dangerous metal that the humans can't pick up, but then it gets stuck because it's stuck between, it can't hurt itself either. It's not supposed to do anything that hurts itself. So it walks in a circle around the dangerous metal until the humans come and rescue it, endangering themselves. That's one example. They just don't work. Take something as simple as preserve human life. We could get in an argument right here about when human life begins. If we expanded talk to the audience, we get an even bigger argument. If we went around the world, we'd have a huge argument about when human life begins. And as we know, in some parts of the world, women and children don't have the same kind of personhood as men. So that would be a whole other calculation you'd have to make these robots compliant. Also, these laws, these rules that we make change over time. What's relevant for us today may not be relevant in 100 years. It will certainly be out of date, just as the laws of 100 years ago seem antiquated and quaint to us now. So programming in ethics into a computer is very, very hard, but we have to do that, and we have to do that soon as we're developing stronger and stronger cognitive architectures.
Now, you also point out that the history of the world has been usually or often indigenous people versus explorers. Is the next step artificial intelligence versus everybody?
Well, there's a great book called Guns, Germs, and Steel, and it points out how every time a more technologically advanced culture meets a primitive culture, the more technologically advanced culture wins, whether it's by poisoning them with the viruses they bring or their superior weaponry. It always happens that way. How do we share the planet with something that's 1,000 or millions of times more generally intelligent in a rational mathematical sense than we are? But this is the trajectory we're on. There's an intelligence race going on right now among 9 major AI players and a lot of minor AI players to create human-level intelligence in a machine. This is really job number 1 for a lot of companies. Beyond that is superintelligence, which is the intelligence that's many times more intelligent in a general sense than we are. So we're creating this machine as fast as we can, but we have no idea how to live with it.
And yet it is so enticing to think that machines or robotic industrial instruments, I won't even use the term robot because we always think of the human form with a robot, right. In very dangerous applications like mining and farming and other industrial applications, and harnessing all that intelligence 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to cure cancer or even to purify water. 2 million people die every year in the world as a result of unpotable water, and wouldn't it be wonderful to harness this to do it? It's kind of enticing, isn't it?
Oh, it really is. I mean, if we thread this needle correctly and we manage to survive the next 40 or 50 years, then a lot of our problems could be solved. Imagine taking 25 PhD quality brains, human level brains in a computer, chaining 25 of them together and having them work 24/7 on climate modeling, solving climate change, on cancer research, on weapons development. One of the things Stephen Hawking said, the late Stephen Hawking, he said, super intelligent machines will be able to design weapons that we don't even understand. So there's a great deal of promise and some peril with what's on the horizon with super intelligent machines. And what we have to understand is that it's really not science fiction. As Stephen Hawking said, in the short term, what we have to worry about is who controls the AI. In the long term, we have to worry about, can the AI be controlled at all? Right now, we're in the short-term problems where we've got a lot of different issues like autonomous battlefield robots and drones, data. Facebook took the data of 70 million Americans and sold it to Cambridge Analytica, which sold it to the Russians, which used it to try and influence an election. We don't know if they succeeded, but we know for certain that they tried to influence the election of 2016.
And funnily enough, that effort was not only a high-tech one, but it was a very low-tech one of thousands of robocalls, which prevented people from being able to call for help on their telephones, which is an old problem we had in radio 50 years ago. A good radio contest in a small city would shut down the phone system for part of the town. So it's an interesting combination of high and low tech.
Mm. Well, you know, low tech still works, but what's as you point out, what's going to be very interesting and perilous is the nexus of AI and malware, for example. Stuxnet was a fairly primitive virus that used some degree of AI, but there are much more powerful viruses coming down the road, and there are much more powerful weapon systems, you know, imbued with AI coming down the road. So we're headed for interesting times.
Let me drag you back to garden variety failure modes and incompetence even. Channeling a book by Greg Ip, I think the title of which is Overcomplicated or something like that. Mm-hmm. You also cite that poor computer programming costs the American economy $60 million a year. It causes all kinds of failures. You rightly quip that if trains and planes and automobiles were as efficient as computers, nobody would drive, fly, or get in a train because they'd be in danger of failing. How can we solve that problem? There are kludges and workarounds and patches and what have you in the computer system that are probably just as dangerous as this high-tech robotics, wouldn't you say?
Yes, you know, the reason I pointed out that bad software is so expensive is because that drives the goal of creating computers that program themselves, better software. Programs that write programs is where this is headed, and right now a lot of companies are working on that to solve this bad computing problem. The Boeing disaster, the two Boeing disasters, is shaping up to be an AI problem. You know, complicated systems fail. There's a great book you cited, a book I'm somewhat familiar with, but there's one that I quote a lot, and that's Charles Perrow's Normal Accidents. And basically, at some level of complexity, our architectures, whether they're airplanes or nuclear power plants or computers or AI systems, they get so complicated that no one person or group of people can really understand what's going on, and they can't anticipate the accidents.
Well, let me double down on that, because you also, I'm not sure if it's channeling Perot, but there are authors around his vintage who also say nobody tests the failure modes of a nuclear plant. You don't blow it up, even though Chernobyl was a testing drill. You don't blow up very many planes or cars. You do crash a few of them. These systems are not only complex, but so expensive, nobody really tests them.
Well, you know, Wendell Wallach at Yale said, we will have with automated systems like this Boeing disaster, automated plus a little bit of AI, with automated systems, maybe what we need is a chastening accident. And then we'll get serious about making really, really solid software that can be tested. The trouble with a lot of the systems we're using right now, we hear about deep learning a lot. Deep learning and evolutionary algorithms, they're both black box systems. We know what the inputs are. We know the data that goes in. And we know we get terrific predictive capabilities with deep learning. So we see what the results are, and they're fabulous. But we don't know what is happening in the middle. We don't know what's going on in a high resolution sense with these systems. How can we use them in cars? Because they're being teed up for use in cars and in other security sensitive systems. If we can't carefully examine the accidents and see what was to blame or who was to blame. You know, our tort law is based on culpability, and we're you know, who's going to be culpable when the software screws up? Is it the coder? Is it the programmer? Is it the car manufacturer? Is it the driver? These are questions that have to be answered before we field these cars and use this software in security sensitive systems.
Well, great question, James Barrat, the author of Our Final Invention. And let me riff on that point that you just made, James, because it took us 30 years to get a treaty to govern the use of Antarctica. It took us 30 years after the first nuclear power plant to get the International Atomic Energy Agency and regulations. We may be at the beginning of trying to regulate artificial intelligence the way we are trying to regulate and control cybersecurity, and that involves the kind of things you talked about, choice of law and choice of jurisdiction. Are we at the beginning of something that will end happily, like Antarctica did and like the IAEA did?
I sure hope so. I'm so glad you brought up the IAEA. This is really our hope. This is really what's going to make the difference between a rosy future and I think a disastrous one. I'm usually the last person to say we need government regulation, but in this case, we need international government regulation. If you look back at nuclear fission, and that's the power behind nuclear power plants, as you cited, and nuclear weapons, there was no maintenance plan for that when it came out. You know, during World War II, when fission really got legs. Before that, it was thought that we split the atom and we get free energy, and this period of utopia will follow. But what happened is we incinerated 2 cities full of people. The technology was quickly weaponized, and then we held a gun to our heads for 50 years with the nuclear arms race. We still have no policy, no governing policy for nuclear fission. We have organizations like the IAEA. We have no policy for AI. We need a international policy for AI, and we need something like the IAEA to govern it and to enforce the treaty.
Well, since we've been book dropping for a while, which is kind of intellectually interesting, you may have seen this one, Warnings, Clark and Eddy. They talk about Cassandras in the good sense of the word, meaning people who warn of dangers in the future. Was that part of your purpose?
You know, it's funny when you see yourself on a street corner holding a sign saying the end is near. You really got to question your motivations. And with our final invention, I felt like that guy on a street corner. I felt like very few people were aware of these problems. Very few people were talking about them, and unfortunately, the scientists that were talking about them weren't terrific communicators. I come from documentary films where everything has to be quite simple. You write the scripts to about a 7th or 8th grade reading level, which is really the reading level of a lot of newspapers in the country, and that's a good thing, so people can understand it. So I felt like a canary in a coal mine, and I'd sit in my basement and write this thing and go, you know, am I nuts, or are people missing this very, very important issue? And as it turned out, it became then, not because of my book, but at the same time, I was part of this zeitgeist. Everybody started talking about it. Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Stuart Russell, really, really high-level AI smart people. And now it's become an issue. But as you said, we're at the beginning of the issue. We're like global warming was in the 1980s. We really need to, but meanwhile, the technology is advancing exponentially. We need to catch up with regulation and supervision of the technology. We can't leave it in individual corporations' hands, because again and again, they show they're not trustworthy. You know, Facebook, Google,
and if you don't mind a Canadian's quip about your man on the street corner with a sign that says the end is near, sometimes we hope that is signaling the end of your apparently never-ending primary season, but that's probably another book with a political scientist. Final question, I think, and it is back to the civil disobedience and security issues that are close to the hearts of people who follow the Mackenzie Institute. You predict modern or future Luddites may even assassinate the CEOs of companies that are developing artificial intelligence, and certainly target their factories. That could spell a lot of civil unrest.
Yes, I wouldn't advocate that. And I was citing a book called The Intellect Wars about that. I was citing, here's the scenario that plays out in this book. I would never, you know, if we're a civilization that can't solve our problems using law and doing things legally and rationally, then we're not worth saving. So I would never advocate violence towards the CEOs of these companies, or violence of any kind, to solve these problems. It never solves problems. It only generates new bitterness and new animosity and new problems.
Now, since you've been a documentary filmmaker, no doubt interviewed people as a result, no doubt interviewed, as I saw in your book, people about this. Let me turn the tables. What did I forget to ask you? What is the question you would have liked to have asked yourself?
Well, you know, when I'm giving talks, which I love doing, especially to university students, because this is going to be their problem more than ours pretty soon. And that's what can you do as a citizen to get involved. And what you can do is learn the basics of AI. You have to get fluent or conversant in the systems that are being used and who's using them for what. When something goes wrong, you have to pay attention. And more, we have to look at the platforms of our politicians for stances on AI. AI is going to be it's the technology that will, just the way that steam powered the 19th century and electricity powered the 20th century, this is AI century. We have to get fluent in it. We have to demand accountability from these corporations. We have to watch them very closely. They cannot govern themselves. And we have to demand legislation and ultimately regulation from our politicians. That's what individuals can do.
James Barrat, thank you very much. And for those who are watching because they switched from either broadcast or cable television to get a respite from the bad news, the book is called Our Final Invention, Artificial Intelligence and the End of the Human Era. So maybe you didn't escape. Thank you, James.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Any views expressed here are not necessarily those of the Mackenzie Institute, its speakers, sponsors, or supporters. But the Institute is dedicated to fostering public discussion, debate, and education about security matters. Google the Mackenzie Institute to join the discussion. The Mackenzie Institute is grateful to its sponsors and supporters. Some of our short pods and long talks are a result of the support of Heathbridge Capital Management Limited, the National Post, and Dundurn Publishing.